The probe landed at dawn. Not because the Valith Expeditionary Survey Division had chosen dawn for symbolic reasons, not because the light had significance in their operational planning, but because the trajectory calculation for the deployment window produced a surface contact at 5:12 local time at the coordinates the division had selected, and 5:12 local time at those coordinates was dawn. And dawn in the Amazon basin was the Amazon basin making the specific sound it made when the night things were finishing, and the day things had not yet started, when the two shifts of a system that had been running its shifts for 50 million years overlapped in the gray light between dark and sun. The probe did not notice the sound. It was not designed to notice sound. It was designed to collect atmospheric composition data and surface temperature readings and biological density estimates and electromagnetic signatures, and to transmit that data to the survey ship in low orbit, where the division's analysts would process it and produce an assessment of the target, environment's characteristics for the expeditionary team that was going to follow. The probe was 4 meters tall and 2 meters wide and made of materials that the Amazon basin had never encountered before, which meant that the Amazon basin's response to it began immediately. Because the Amazon basin's response to everything began immediately. Because the Amazon basin was the most comprehensively alive thing on the surface of the planet Earth, and it had been responding to things immediately for 50 million years, and had developed, across those 50 million years, an immune system that operated at every scale simultaneously, from the cellular to the ecological, and which did not require a decision to respond, which responded because response was what it was made of. Within 4 minutes of surface contact, a column of leafcutter ants had found the probe's base struts and were attempting to disassemble them. The attempt was unsuccessful because the materials were not disassemblable by leafcutter ant mandibles, but the attempt had been made within 4 minutes because the Amazon did not wait to understand what something was before it began figuring out what to do with it. Within 11 minutes, 3 separate species of fungus had begun colonization attempts on the probe's lower surfaces. Within 22 minutes, a caiman 4 meters long had positioned itself in the water 7 meters from the probe's base, and was watching it with the patient attention that caimans applied to everything that appeared in their territory, which was total and unblinking and very old. The probe transmitted its data for 6 hours. The analysts on the survey ship processed the data for 3. Their assessment said, target environment is high-complexity biological system. Surface conditions are challenging for extended operations due to temperature, humidity, and biological density. The biological density reading is the highest the division's sensors have recorded in 11 survey operations across 9 different planetary environments. The electromagnetic interference from the biological activity is significant and will affect sensor performance at ground level. The environment is hostile to unprotected equipment. Recommend full environmental protection protocols for ground team equipment. The assessment said other things too, things that filled 17 pages of technical documentation about atmospheric composition and temperature ranges and precipitation patterns, and the specific challenges that the target environment presented to the expeditionary team's equipment and operations. The assessment did not say what the Amazon basin was. Not because the analysts were careless, because the Amazon basin was not the kind of thing that sensor data and 3 hours of processing produced. The Amazon basin was the kind of thing that 50 million years produced, and 50 million years was not in the dataset because the dataset was 6 hours of probe transmission, and 6 hours of probe transmission was not 50 million years, was not even close to 50 million years. Was a single frame from a film that was 50 million years long, and that was playing continuously, and had been playing continuously, and was going to keep playing after the expeditionary team came and went regardless of what the expeditionary team did, because that was what the Amazon basin did. It kept playing. The expeditionary team was 12 operators. The Valith Survey Division's ground teams were not military. They were scientists and surveyors and logistics specialists who had been trained for the specific operational environment of alien planetary surfaces. They had done this on 9 different planets and had been effective on all 9, because the environments they had encountered had been the kinds of environments that sensor data and assessment reports described accurately. The kinds of environments that were complicated because of temperature or atmospheric composition, or geological instability or biological hazards, that were dangerous in the specific ways that dangerous things were dangerous, when the danger was individual and identifiable, and could be avoided or neutralized by sufficiently careful operators with sufficiently good equipment. The Amazon basin was not that kind of environment. The Amazon basin was dangerous in the way that 50 million years of practice at being dangerous produced, which was not individual and identifiable but collective and ambient. Not the danger of specific things that could be avoided, but the danger of a system that had been optimizing for the continuation of itself for long enough that the optimization was complete. And the system was not dangerous as a side effect of what it was, but dangerous as the expression of what it was. The team landed at the coordinates the probe had transmitted. The coordinates were in a section of the basin that the sensor data described as accessible, which it was, accessible in the way that the Amazon was accessible, which was to say that if you were there you were in it, and being in it was the whole situation. Team leader Voth Ken had been running planetary surface surveys for 8 years. She was experienced and careful, and had survived 9 deployments in environments that the assessment division had classified as hostile, and surviving 9 hostile deployments had produced in her the specific confidence of someone who had been in difficult places and had come out of them, and who understood, from the experience of coming out of them, what made difficult places manageable. She stepped out of the landing vessel at 800. The Amazon basin stepped around her. Not metaphorically, not as a way of describing the sensory experience of entering a dense tropical rainforest, literally. In the sense that the system that was the Amazon basin was already responding to her presence the moment she was present in it, was already doing what it did to things that entered it, which was to begin the process of understanding them and figuring out what to do with them. The humidity hit first. Not as a condition of the air, but as a quality of the air, the specific quality of air that has been breathing itself through 50 million years of biological cycles, and that carries in it the history of everything that has breath through it, that is not just humid, but is alive with humidity in a way that the word humid did not fully capture. The sound hit second. The Amazon at 800 was the Amazon in full day operation, all shifts running, the overlay of a system that never stopped, layered in frequencies that the survey team's acoustic sensors were going to spend the next 6 hours failing to fully resolve, because there were more simultaneous sound sources within 100 meters of the landing site than the acoustic sensors had been designed to process. The weight hit third, not physical weight, the weight of being watched, not by anything specific, by everything. Ken noted all 3 in her operational log and classified them under environmental conditions, high complexity, and moved to the assessment checklist. The team spread into their survey pattern. Standard protocol for initial surface contact, distribute across a defined area, collect data from multiple points, transmit to the ship, build the ground-level picture that the probe's orbital transmission could not produce. The survey pattern took them through 400 meters of the Amazon basin. 400 meters. In 400 meters, the Amazon basin produced the following events, all of which were logged and transmitted, and which the analysis team on the ship spent 2 hours trying to categorize. At meter 63, survey operator Dresh found that the equipment case he was carrying had acquired 47 individual organisms across its exterior surface during the 12 minutes he had been moving through the terrain, organisms representing 11 distinct species, none of which had been on the equipment case when he started walking. At meter 107, the team's navigation system produced a course correction alert that identified an obstacle in the path ahead and recommended a detour. The obstacle was a column of army ants 3 meters wide and of indeterminate length, moving across the team's survey line in the specific organized way that army ants moved, which was as a single entity rather than a collection of individuals, and which produced, when the team's sensor package attempted to characterize it, a reading that the sensor package's interpretation software flagged as ambiguous, because the reading was consistent with both individual organisms and a coordinated system, and the software could not determine which framework was the more accurate description of what it was looking at. The answer was both. At meter 189, survey operator Thess disturbed a camouflaged organism that the sensor package had not resolved as present until it moved, and that upon moving was identified as a fertilance viper of significant size, which was a species that the pre-deployment biological briefing had mentioned in the section on organisms to avoid, and that the team was very glad they had read that section. At meter 241, team leader Ken stopped walking because the terrain in front of her had changed in a way that the terrain should not have been able to change, which was that the ground cover in a 2-meter section of the survey path had rearranged itself between her last visual check and the current moment, and the rearrangement was not explained by any mechanism she could identify. She scanned the rearranged section. The scan returned a reading that she looked at for a moment before she understood what she was looking at. The reading showed a biological signature that was continuous across the 2-meter section, and that extended beyond the sensor's resolution range in both directions along the survey path, which meant the biological entity the sensor was reading was at least as long as the sensor could resolve and possibly longer. She looked at the reading. She said into her communication system, "All operators stop. Hold positions. I need a cross-reference from every sensor package in the team on my current position." The cross-references came back. She looked at them. The biological entity the sensors were reading was 7 meters from her current position, oriented along the survey path, and extended beyond sensor resolution in both directions. The entity was not moving. It was present and still and had been there, the retrospective analysis of the sensor data showed, since before the team had started the survey pattern, which meant it had been in the survey area when the team landed and had remained in the survey area as the team moved through it. The sensor package's biological classification system identified the entity as a constrictor species. Specifically, it identified it as Unex murinus, the green anaconda. The sensor package's size estimation, cross-referenced against the team's multiple sensors, produced a figure that Ken looked at and then ran again because the figure seemed inconsistent with the biological briefing. The biological briefing had said that green anacondas reached lengths of up to 8 meters. The sensor package was estimating the entity in her current survey area at somewhere between 9 and 11 meters, which was outside the briefing's parameters, which meant either the sensors were producing an error or this specific individual was outside the briefing's parameters. The entity had not moved. Ken looked at the 2-meter section of rearranged ground cover and understood that the rearrangement she had noticed was the entity adjusting its position very slightly at some point in the preceding minutes, and that the adjustment was what had caught her attention, and that if the adjustment had not happened, she would not have noticed the entity because the entity was not distinguishable from the surrounding terrain when it was not moving. An entity of somewhere between 9 and 11 meters was not distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. She said into her communication system, "Everyone remain still. I am going to transmit the current sensor readings to the ship for analysis. Do not make sudden movements." She transmitted. On the survey ship, the analysis team received the readings and spent 40 minutes producing their response. The response said, "The biological entity is a green anaconda, Unex murinus, consistent with the species profile in the pre-deployment biological database except in the size parameter, which exceeds the database maximum. The species is a non-venomous constrictor. It is not typically aggressive toward large organisms unless provoked. It is an ambush predator that uses camouflage and stillness as its primary hunting technique. The current behavior, remaining still in the presence of the survey team, is consistent with typical species behavior. Recommend the survey team maintain distance and stillness, and the entity will likely move away on its own timeline." Ken read the response. She said, "Define own timeline." The analysis team said, "Species typically remain stationary for extended periods when not actively hunting. The timeline is not predictable from the available data." She said, "Extended periods means what?" The analysis team said, "Hours to days." She said, "We are 30 meters from our egress path, and the entity is between us and the egress path." The analysis team said, "Understood. The entity is not between all operators and the egress path. You are directly in line. Other operators have alternative routes to egress." She said, "I am not leaving operators in the field." The analysis team said, "Understood." There was a pause. Then the analysis team said, "We are reviewing additional biological data on the species. We will transmit updates as they are available." Ken looked at the ground cover, at the entity that was not distinguishable from the terrain, at something between 9 and 11 meters of evolutionary expertise in not being seen until it decided to be seen. She thought about the operational log entry she was going to write. She thought it was going to be the most unusual operational log entry she had written in 8 years of planetary surface surveys. She said into the communication system, "All operators maintain current positions. We are waiting." Survey operator Geth, who was the team's biological specialist and who had been consulting his reference database for the past 40 minutes, said, "Team leader, I have additional information on the species that may be operationally relevant." She said, "Transmit." He said, "The green anaconda is the heaviest snake species on Earth by mass. The largest documented individuals exceed 250 kilograms. At the size the sensors are estimating, this individual may be the largest documented individual of the species. I wanted to note this because the size parameter appears to be an outlier even within the species, and I think that is operationally relevant context." She said, "Why is it operationally relevant that this is an unusually large individual?" He said, "Because unusually large individuals of apex predator species that have survived to become unusually large have done so by being exceptionally effective at what they do. The typical size parameter represents average survival. Outlier size represents outlier survival capability. This individual has been doing what it does for long enough to become what it is." She said, "Which is?" He said, "A predator that is not distinguishable from the terrain when it chooses to not be distinguishable from the terrain, that has been here longer than we have been here, that knew we were here before we knew it was here, and that has not moved because it does not need to move." She looked at the ground cover. She said, "It does not need to move." He said, "It is in the Amazon basin. We came to it. It is waiting to see what we do." She looked at the entity's position on her sensor display. She thought about the assessment report, about high-complexity biological system, about the biological density reading being the highest the division sensors had recorded in 11 survey operations. She thought that the assessment report had been accurate about the density, and had not captured what the density was. She said, "Geth, the camouflage, how complete is it?" He said, "The sensor data shows that the entity's dorsal patterning matches the surrounding terrain at a level that our visual sensors could not distinguish. The match is not approximate. It is specific to this exact section of terrain, which means the entity has been in this position long enough for the patterning to be calibrated to this exact location." She said, "How long?" He said, "I do not know, long enough." She said, "Long enough to calibrate to the specific terrain." He said, "Yes." She thought about that. She said, "It was here before us." He said, "Yes." She said, "And it knew we were coming." He said, "I do not know if it knew. I know it was positioned here before our arrival and has remained positioned here through our arrival and movement in the area. Whether that represents knowledge of our coming or presence in the territory that we entered is a distinction I cannot resolve from the available data." She said, "Practically speaking." He said, "Practically speaking, it was here and we came to it." She looked at the sensor display. She looked at the ground cover. She said, "How does this end?" He said, "The entity will move when it decides to move. We cannot predict the timeline. We cannot accelerate it. We can attempt to make ourselves less interesting to it, which the literature suggests means stillness and minimal stimulus production, or we can attempt an alternative egress that does not cross its current position, which would require moving through terrain to the north that our sensors have not cleared." She said, "The terrain to the north has not been cleared." He said, "No." She said, "And the entity is to the south." He said, "Yes." She said, "So we can wait or we can move through terrain that might contain more things we have not cleared." He said, "That is an accurate summary." She said, "In the Amazon basin." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "We wait." They waited for 4 hours and 17 minutes. In 4 hours and 17 minutes, the Amazon basin continued to be what it was, which was everything, simultaneously, at every scale. The fungus continued its work. The leafcutter ants moved their column through the area on a route that passed within 3 meters of 3 operators, and did not deviate for the operators, because the route was the route, and the operators were in the Amazon basin, and the Amazon basin did not deviate routes for things that had been there for 6 hours. A taper appeared at the edge of the sensor range, looked at the survey team with the patient assessment of a species that had been looking at things in this forest for millions of years, and had survived by being accurate about what it was looking at, and moved away in the direction that its assessment said was the correct direction. A troop of spider monkeys moved through the canopy above the team, and produced opinions about the team in the specific vocal register that spider monkeys used for opinions about things that were in their territory, and that they had not decided what to do with yet. The caiman, or a different caiman, appeared in the water to the team's west, and watched them with the total patient attention that caimans applied to watching. The entity to the south did not move. At the 4-hour and 11-minute mark, Survey Operator Reth, who was the team's youngest member and who had been in surface surveys for 2 years, and who had been maintaining stillness for 4 hours and 11 minutes with the specific discomfort of someone who had trained for stillness, but had not yet trained for 4 hours of it, transmitted on the team channel. He said, "Team leader." She said, "Operator Reth." He said, "I have been looking at the sensor display for 4 hours. The entity has not moved in 4 hours." She said, "Correct." He said, "It was not moving before we arrived. It is not moving now. How do we know it is aware of us?" Geth said, "Because its respiratory pattern changed when we arrived." Reth said, "You have been monitoring its respiratory pattern." Geth said, "For 4 hours, yes. The respiratory rate when the team arrived was 2 breaths per minute, which is consistent with a resting state. After the team arrived, it shifted to 4 breaths per minute. The shift was immediate and has been maintained throughout the 4 hours." Reth said, "So it is aware of us." Geth said, "It knows exactly where we are and has known since before we knew where it was." The entity moved at hour 4 and 17 minutes. Not quickly, not the explosive movement of a predator striking. The slow, deliberate, total movement of something large enough and confident enough that speed was not the relevant variable. That presence was the relevant variable. And presence at 9 to 11 meters of green Anaconda moving through the terrain it had been calibrated to for longer than the survey team had existed was a demonstration of presence that the team's sensor packages spent 6 minutes trying to fully characterize. It moved south, away from the team's position, into the terrain it had come from, or that it was, depending on how you understood the relationship between the entity and the Amazon basin that had produced it. It disappeared into that terrain in the way that things disappeared into the Amazon basin, which was completely and without remainder, one moment present and the next moment not present, and the terrain unchanged by the transition, because the entity was not separate from the terrain, and its movement through it was not the movement of something through something else, but the movement of a system rearranging itself. Ken watched the sensor display until the entity was beyond sensor range. Then she looked at her operational log. Then she said, "All operators, we are resuming the survey pattern, egress in 30 minutes." The team moved. They completed the survey pattern and reached the landing vessel and completed the egress and were on the survey ship at 1600. Ken wrote her operational log entry that evening. The entry said, "The target environment designated Amazon Basin represents a category of biological system that the division's assessment protocols do not fully characterize. The high complexity designation is accurate but insufficient. The environment is not complex in the way that the assessment protocols define complexity, which is the number of biological actors and the density of their interactions. The environment is complex in a different way, which is the depth of the optimization that 50 million years of continuous operation has produced. The entities in this environment are not individually dangerous in the way that the biological briefing characterizes individual danger. They are expressions of a system that has been optimizing for 50 million years, and in which every entity is the product of everything that has survived in it for that entire period. The green Anaconda individual we encountered is not an outlier. It is the system's current expression of what survives when the system has been running long enough. That expression is not predictable from the biological database, because the biological database characterizes the average, and the system does not produce averages. It produces whatever has lasted." She paused in the writing. She added, "The entity was in our survey area before we arrived. It was aware of our presence immediately. It remained still for 4 hours and 17 minutes and then moved away. I do not know what the 4 hours and 17 minutes represented in terms of the entity's decision-making process. I know that we did not produce a response that it needed to address actively, and I know that when it decided to move, it moved in a direction that did not bring it into contact with the team, and that I am writing this entry because of those two facts. The decisions that produced those facts were not ours. They were the entities. We were in its environment, and it made the decisions, and we were here to receive them." She paused again. She said, "I want to note for the division's future operational planning that the Amazon Basin is not an environment that the expeditionary team controls when it is in it. It is an environment that has been running for 50 million years, and that the expeditionary team enters and moves through for the duration of its operational window. The system permits this, or it does not. The system that produced the green Anaconda, the leafcutter ants, the caiman, the fertilants, the spider monkeys, the fungus that attempted to colonize our equipment within 11 minutes of surface contact, that system is not responding to us. We are a stimulus in its response pattern. The distinction is significant and should be incorporated into future operational planning for environments of this type." She completed the log entry. She filed it. She sat in her quarters on the survey ship and thought about 4 hours and 17 minutes of waiting in the Amazon basin, and about what had been waiting with her in the terrain that she could not see until it decided to move. She thought about 9 to 11 meters of calibration to a specific section of ground that had taken long enough to produce. She thought about the respiratory rate shifting from 2 to 4 breaths per minute the moment the team arrived. She thought about the decisions the entity had made and the fact that she was here to think about them. She thought those were related facts. She thought the relationship between those facts was the most important operational data the survey had produced. She wrote one final note in her personal log that was not the operational log, and that was not filed with the division. The note said, "The Amazon basin watched us from the moment we arrived. The oldest thing in it watched us longest. It decided we did not require action. I intend to spend some time thinking about what that decision was based on and whether we would have made the same decision in its position." She closed the log. Outside the survey ship, in low orbit above the Amazon basin, the sensors showed the basin in the way that orbital sensors showed things, which was from far enough away that the individual expressions of 50 million years of operation were not individually visible, and the basin was a single green shape against the planet's larger shapes. A single green shape that was breathing. That had always been breathing. That was going to keep breathing. The probe was still in it somewhere. The fungus was still working on it.